How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. I got a couple computers going at the same time, so I was trying to figure out which computer I had to use to unmute me.
Can everyone hear? Okay, great. So we will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay. How Danielle? Which you are you turning it over to?
To you, Jerry.
Oh. Okay. How you guys doing? My name is Jerry Neri. I'm the executive director of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition. And this is my colleague, Katie Brown. Um, we are here isolating at the GCNAC offices in the unceded uh, land of the Shawnee and the Miamia. It's important to always remember and understand that the land that we are on, that it belongs to at least 50 native tribes that at one time or another called Cincinnati home. Um, what we're going to do today is we're going to go ahead and have a discussion about boarding schools and the issues that were brought up because of boarding schools. There is, first of all, my name is not my name. My name comes from a school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that was named after Saint Philip Neri. My father, his name was taken from him, and the name that he was given was the name of the church. His father also, the same thing happened to him. The name that he was given was taken from him, and was the name that he took was the name of the church. This was quite common at the time. The boarding schools in the United States existed, some of them up until the 1990s, but most of them were closed down by the 1970s. But definitely within my lifetime, I have siblings that were in boarding schools. And like I said, my father was in a boarding school, and my grandfather was in a boarding school as well. Um, so not only was our identity taken from us, but our language was taken from us as well. And as everyone is aware, um, that I'm pretty positive most people are aware of the issues that happen within boarding schools in the United States. But briefly, what it amounts to, according to the UN, it amounts to cultural genocide because our language was taken from us, and we were not able to speak our language. We were often beaten, punished, um, because of uh, because of not speaking English, because our culture was taken from us, um, and because our hair was cut, because we were our the way we dressed was taken from us, and we were made to dress like Europeans. Even our belief system, the majority of the boarding schools that were in the United States were run or contracted out to the Catholic Church. And so Catholicism and Christianity was basically beat into us. And the way our traditional cultural beliefs were taken from us, and we were forced into Catholicism. The number, the numbers that we have for children that who were found in Canada and in mass graves at these boarding schools is someplace between 6 and 7,000. So these schools, there are no other schools in the United States or in Canada except for Native American boarding schools that had cemeteries and mass graves of the children who attended these schools. So when you have 7,000 children so far that have been found in Canada alone at the 139 boarding schools there. And we're just now starting in the United States. The United States had twice as many boarding schools as Canada. The model that Canada had for its boarding schools was taken from the model that the US had given them. So we're expecting to find at least twice as many children in the United States. However, there has been pushback, at least for the past 6 years, if not longer, from the US government as far as giving us the records, letting us do the investigations, doing the ground radar that checks for mass graves. All of these things, the government hasn't really wanted us to do. Deb Haaland, who is the head of the Department of Interior and is also a Native American, is the first Native American to head the Department of the Interior. She has agreed to work with us in conjunction with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition for the first time. So we're going to start addressing and trying to find if there are, how many children that we can are buried in mass graves all over the country. And this is egregious. This is unfortunate and egregious. And according to the UN, this is cultural genocide. And this is part of what we went through. In my lifetime, I was 14 years old before we were allowed to practice our religion in this country. So until 1978, Native Americans were not allowed to practice their religion, their culture, their belief. It was against the law. That's part of why a lot of the massacres that occurred 100 years ago were because Native Americans were practicing their religious beliefs. Up until 2016, I was witness to federal agents pulling Native Americans out of their ceremonies. 2005, I seen federal agents come in with a bulldozer and plow over a ceremony that was in progress, remove everyone from the ceremony, came in with automatic weapons, made everyone leave the ceremony, and then came in with a bulldozer and bulldozed the ceremony over. And these are things that are happening in our country. These are things that happen, to us. If you're Native, none of these stories seem completely outrageous because we're aware of this. We know what's happened in our country. We know what's happened to us. And the thing is that because of all these atrocities that have happened to Native Americans and to the survivors of those boarding schools, that creates years and years and years of generational trauma. And that trauma is passed down from grandmother to mother to child. And we all experience that generational trauma. So much so that now that they're starting to unearth some of these remains and return them to the tribes, 9 children were recently returned to the Lakota people in South Dakota that they found. And this brings up a lot of trauma for a lot of people. And a lot of Native people, they don't even know, they weren't even aware where this trauma came from, but it's that generational trauma of those generations of ancestors that experienced life in those boarding schools. A lot of the diseases that these children died from were preventable, but healthcare wasn't a priority at the time at these boarding schools. And speaking to survivors now, a lot of them, they don't even want to talk about it, you know. And the reason why it's so important that we recognize the Department of Interior and Deb Haaland right now is because Native people, especially those who are enrolled in federally recognized tribes, they belong to the Department of Interior. The Department of Interior controls wildlife and game and fish and American Indians. We're the only race of people in the United States that falls under the Department of Interior and has the federal government as our ward. Even today, the Department of Interior, they control all the funds, all the money, and everything that happens on any of the 500 reservations in the United States. So when you look at the poor conditions on a reservation and you look at the lack of health care, you look at the lack of education, all of this is built into the system because the tribes are not responsible for the conditions that they live in. The Department of Interior, the tribes have to go through the Department of Interior in order to make any changes on the reservation because the tribes are wards of the Department of Interior. And the bureaucracy involved in building a hospital, in building a house, in maintaining a road, all of these things go through the bureaucracy of the Department of Interior. So this is all built into that final plan. When you look at the final part of the 500 years of continued genocide on our people, this is the final plan. Disenrolling Native people, bringing them to urban areas, assimilating them. You have identity dysphoria and people being told that they're not Native anymore, people being told that there are no more Native Americans, schools, the government turning a blind eye to schools that still use racist mascots, that still teach outdated narratives on the history of the United States. The erasure of a people is a part of that cultural genocide, the erasure of the truth of what's happened. And when you have truth and reconciliation, when you look at what Canada calls truth and reconciliation, you have to speak the truth. Before you can have reconciliation, you have to tell the truth of what's happened, not only to our people, but all people of color that lived through that experience of creating the United States. Racism and colonization, racism and colonialism are wed. They were a part of that plan that started in Virginia and continues today. And whether it's gentrification, or you look back to redlining, or you look at forced relocations of Native people, it's all the same thing. And it's important that we recognize that, because they can call it by any different name, but it's the same thing. And the policies, they just rename them and it's a little bit more of microaggression instead of in your face, but they still want the same result. You know, we tell our children that existence is resistance. It's important for us to understand just the act of waking up in the morning, just the act of still being here, that's a part of that resistance. That's a part of fighting against a system that didn't want us here from the beginning. And the problems that we experience now, not only as Native people, but as people of color, the problems that we experience in this system is because they didn't expect us to be here. They didn't expect us to survive and be here and continue to thrive. And the boarding school experience is a major part of that, because you can look at even today in public schools, in public education, in the things that are happening in our neighborhoods, in the things that are happening in our schools. There are a lot of people who are privileged in a socioeconomic way, and they are getting the education that all of us should be getting. And if you don't fit a certain profile, the education that you end up getting is going to be much less. I'm preaching to the choir, and I'm certain of that. But back to the boarding schools. There are two words: truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation means that at some point in time, there was a relationship that was good, and then the relationship went bad, and now we're trying to reconciliate and make that relationship good again. But the indigenous experience, the native experience, is we have never had a good relationship with the United States government. We have never had a good relationship with the government in Canada, nor the governments that are in South or Central America. The extermination and those policies of forced removal and broken treaties have existed for 500 years. So there's never been a point in history that there has ever been a good relationship. You cannot have reconciliation without conciliation. And that's the part of truth that we need to tell, is that we can start today on a good relationship. We can start today on building a relationship and building a future that we all can be a part of. But it starts by telling the truth that there's never been a good period of time in history for Native people or people of color in this country. It's always been this way, and we have constantly been victims of that cultural genocide. And that started with the forced removal of children from their parents and being forced into boarding schools and being sexually and physically abused, not having access to adequate health care, and being allowed to starve to death or be beaten to death or die of diseases that they didn't need to die from, and then being buried in mass graves. A lot of these children will never know who they are. The church and the government has intentionally destroyed the records and the paper trail of the children that were buried. Only now, because of the technology that exists, we're able to go in and find these mass graves. And if we didn't have this technology, neither the government nor the church would ever step up and say, these are the things that happened at these schools. We can't disturb the resting place of these children, but we can recognize that these children are there. We can recognize that these things happened in our country, and that that's a part of the history that we have. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop preaching, step off my pulpit here, and see if there's any questions. Anybody got anything they want to ask?
Hi, I'm Harry. I'm the artistic director. Thank you for being with us today. The question I have specifically is, after reading the supportive materials you suggested of being an ally and an accomplice, what can we do specifically with making sure the information about residential schools and the atrocities are continuing to be remembered?
I think there's several things that we can do. Do you have anything that you think off the top of your head?
I think first and foremost is just acknowledging the reality of what happened at boarding schools and to continue to raise awareness in your own communities and your own circles about what happened there, and being really honest about the impacts that that continues to have today. This is my first thought.
I agree. You know, the to be able to tell a story, we can stand up here and preach all day long. But until people are talking about these things in their own circles and are starting to recognize the egregiousness of what has happened, there are the descendants of those people who created the atrocities that have happened to all people of color. Their descendants are actively working to erase and keep that information from being taught in schools. The people that created this history, their descendants now don't want that history to be taught. And that is egregious in itself. So not only this, but other things that have happened, we have to make sure that these things are being taught in schools, that we stay active in school school board meetings, and we're active in our children's lives, and we're active in making sure that there is a curriculum that tells the truth about what has happened, and this doesn't get whitewashed, and it becomes a part of a book that no one reads anymore. That's important. Secondly, I think it's important because of electronic media to include that in your websites, in your Facebook pages, in your social media, to say give a brief description of this story, and then create a link that says if you want more information about this, click on this link so we can give you more information. And there's a lot of in that in itself, a lot of people are going to click on that link, and a lot of people are gonna go to those websites and read about it. That's it. I mean, pretty much just stay current on it, and keep talking about it in your circles, and make sure that people are aware of what's happening.
You can also reach out to your representatives to encourage them to support investigations of boarding schools, and to reach out to you can give public comments to policies proposed by the Department of the Interior, and just supporting further investigation into what happened and discovering the bodies of the children that we know are there.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Jerry. My name is Jaden. Our paths have actually crossed before. I am a graduate of Anderson High School, which I am sure you are very familiar with. As you were talking, I was remembering a lot of when I had interacted with you in years past, as it resulted to the mascot. But I think my question now is that in their change, which I'm incredibly grateful for, and I am sure you are too, what's next for schools like them who, you know, there's a change in mascot, but there's no education work that's being changed to back that. What are your suggestions for like how family members who are Native American in the communities can work to heal that trauma, specifically in their educational curriculum?
So Anderson High School is a really good example of allies and accomplices, because the Native American community had tried for decades, literally since the 70s, to bring about change. I apologize, at least since the 90s, to bring about change involving Anderson High School's mascot. And until the community itself, until there were parents and there were students and there were alumni who weren't Native American, until they recognized their problematic mascot, and they were able to understand why their mascot was racist. They were the ones that made the change, because they were a part of that community. Native Americans and other people of color have been othered so much by this country and by communities that when something happens, it's acceptable to laugh about it or make jokes about it, because when people are othered, it's easier for parents and children to see them as something other than human. My brother and I, we don't have the same father. We had different fathers. My brother's father in the 70s was beaten by some students. He was beaten unconscious and drugged to death by a logging chain behind a pickup truck down a dirt road. When they found his body, they had carved the word Redskin in his chest with a knife. This is our history. And by the way, they did very little time for doing this. This was in the 70s, and the community at the time, it's just another, it was just another dead Indian in that community. It was a border town. But this is when people bring up why the word Redskins is so derogatory and why there are Native people that are so traumatized just by that, that didn't honor anybody. But that's my story. What was important is that there were people in the community who finally recognized it on their own and were able to make those changes. As far as education and how you start working towards talking more about that, we have to broaden curriculum. We have to make it so that people of color are included in our classrooms, not just when it's Native American Month or when it's Black History Month, but every month, every day in the classrooms. When we talk about science, when we talk about math, when we talk about technology, we need to be talking about these people of color who made changes, who created things that have changed the history of our world. They're indigenous people who were creating calendars and doing advanced math when our European counterparts were, still throwing rocks at fire and wondering where it came from. And this is something that that's not being taught, unless it was, whether it has to do with socialism or communism and or philosophy. These things existed in all indigenous communities. These things existed around the world, but we only talk about them if a white European man created it, or when the white European man started talking about it, they automatically credit the Europeans with creating it, whether it's Karl Marx or, Newton or Einstein. There are so many discoveries, so many things that we need to change about history, and we need to start talking about the discoveries that were made by Native people, by indigenous people, by people of color. And that just takes time. May not happen in our lifetimes or your lifetimes, but hopefully maybe in our children or our children's lifetimes. Okay. Any other questions? All right, I think my time is up here. Taylor, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll go from there.
Yes, thank you so much. Now we're going to hear from we're going to hear from Danielle a little more specifically about her piece and how this piece of music that we are so fortunate to be a part of came to be.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about about this piece. When Harry was talking to me about it, well, we were talking about a different piece that was already written, and then Harry was like, well, can you tell me about your experience? And we got talking about, my mother is also a survivor of the residential school system, Intermountain Boarding School, which was in Utah and run by the Mormon Church. And so we got talking about that and how the unmarked graves and the mass graves have been being found throughout North America, and how even in like social justice circles, people had no idea about these atrocities that are finally being unearthed, like things like that we already knew in the Native community. And so I was like, yeah, we'll write a piece, I guess. And I'm just so grateful that not just for the performance, but for being so open to learning about the Native experience and about not just singing the notes and rhythms, but really finding the essence of the music and the motivation behind it. So Little Ones is the name of the piece, and it's a set of miniatures that's for the children. For the
Danielle, before you get into it, can I invite you all to open up your scores and maybe to follow along?
Great. So the first miniature is from This Land Is Your Land, which everybody knows as a patriotic song. I think we all sang it when we were kids. And I think most people of color sing the song, and it always feels a little wrong. Like even when you're a kid, you're like, okay. And so I kind of wanted to take the tune and adulterate it a little bit. And so you'll notice, like, as you go through, that there are the parts where the major dissonances come in and where the adulteration of the tune comes in are on words like your and my, and even like California. And so like these European words that we've been using for land that was never owned, because in the indigenous way, we don't own the land, like we work together with the land. And so just nobody likes this song. So I was like, let's make it more interesting. So that's kind of the inspiration behind that one. And and also as I go along, if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. I'm happy to, if I skip over anything or whatever. So and then the next part of the piece is called Brought to the Faith, and it is mainly focused on spoken word. So as the choir is providing like an ascending ostinato, basically, once we get into it after like the no section, there are quotes from the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and the Doctrine of Discovery. And I chose those texts to include because I think it's important to see that colonialism and genocide has been going on for a long time. And like, I just feel like the more times we hear these like ridiculous words that are written in our like most important documents of this country, that like in the more context that we can hear them, the more people perhaps will understand like the huge history of like yeah, of genocide and colonization and everything. And so, yeah, that one's that one. And I like this. I like this one a lot. The feeling of like sticks and everything. I think it. I hope that it will have like just kind of an amorphous and like timeless feel under it. And so it's like really focusing on the words, but also feels like you never quite know where the downbeat is and how it's like just kind of weird, the different phrases going on. And I think that can represent that it's still going on. Like we don't know where the downbeat is in the indigenous community, like where things are going to change. Like we keep trying, we keep going like in these ascending lines, and we're not quite sure where it ends or where it begins. And as we go on, the next movement is called Beginnings of an Elegy. And this takes like portions from Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings. And I often include small quotes from pieces written by European composers, because I think as a composer, it's important to me to not hide or to pretend like I haven't been influenced by European music culture. Like I'm trained in classical composition and conducting. So of course that's going to be something that is in my music. And to me, that doesn't mean that I have to represent the colonizer. Like as a mixed race person, as my mother, we're from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and the Red Cliff Band of Ojibways in Wisconsin. And my father is Irish Polish. And so I think it's important for me as a composer to recognize those both sides and to realize that there is no black and white, especially when it comes to art. Like I can recognize the atrocities of one side that did to the other, like being both part of the colonized and the colonizer community, which I'm sure like many mixed race people can relate to. And yeah, so in this one, I call it the beginnings of an elegy because it never quite finishes. The phrase is never quite done and it's always interrupted. And I think this represents that we are finding the children and we are choosing to, like in Canada, are choosing to like look for the children. So we're like beginning. There are some children being returned to their tribes and being returned home, but it's not finished. And the work, and I think this one is supposed to feel uncomfortable in a way. Like this comes in after this really intense movement of we're hearing all these terrible words that have been said about colonization and the worth of people. And then we get into this beautiful little easy piece, but then it's supposed to make you uncomfortable because you shouldn't be finding a place of rest. Like there isn't, I think in this this whole first section, there's never a place of rest. It's always, it should be representing that like this is an ongoing struggle that has been going on. And yeah, and so even though it's beautiful and amorphous and like very traditional harmony, then, but it still shouldn't ever like end. We're not gonna be having like a, you know, like, oh great, now we've reached a wonderful C major, you know, even though we sing those chords, but they don't just represent rest in there. So, and as we go on, we get to Lullaby, the last movement. And I really love this movement. I think this is my favorite one. And it starts with like semi-pitched whisper tones saying like wait in like an F major area. And I think this is also has a amorphous feel like the rest of the piece has, where you're not quite sure where it's going. And I think I chose the word wait because I think there's often a trend like within our community that like within the American community that we find something really hot in the social justice movement and everybody's like super stoked about it. We're all the activists and we're just doing it. And then after it falls out of fashion, it just goes on to something else. And it's like we just forget and that we've never learned about it. And I think that's especially true in the indigenous community and indigenous movements because our genocide is different from the genocide of many other people of color. because we were meant to be exterminated, and many other groups of color were meant to be subjugated. And so the extermination of us as people, like I'm sure everybody has heard people talking about Native Americans, and they use the word was or were. There were Native Americans here, and that is something that is, I think, unique to the indigenous community, and something that I've noticed and is pretty powerful for me. But then it moves on into a duet, and this duet, as you can see, has a ton of voice crossings between the two voices. And this whole movement is about like Mother Earth, Father Sky, and the entanglement between humanity and nature, and how there is no ownership over nature, and that we're together moving in different ways, but in together in a beautiful way. So that goes on, and obviously like the big climax of the piece happens where we all split into many parts. And I think this part of the piece is really about how there is still strength and there is still hope, even though we're in an extremely difficult time in the indigenous community right now, because the atrocities that we've always known are there are starting to be uncovered, but they're also, because they're being uncovered, they're starting to, the governments and the church and everything is starting already to try to put that down. Like even in Canada, they're like, oh, well, we will have truth and reconciliation, but there is nothing that's actually happening. They love to say that word, but nothing's happening. And so even though it is a difficult time, like the text in this one, down in the arms of Mother Earth, safe in a blanket of red dirt. We've missed you, but don't worry, little one. We know that through your strength, we've kept our song. And so I think that, that like, we won't forget them. And that this might be a call to action to your audience that they shouldn't forget them either. Like, I think if we want to compare it to the most known about genocide within the Western world, so the Holocaust, I think that the Jewish community, it's really important to them that they still remind the general public through museums, through teaching. They've been super active trying to maintain that education so that it never happens again. And I think that that's something that we can call to action for the indigenous genocide. And so this is a movement that it's not just music to like make you feel sad or make you feel calm because now we're in like a more tonal sphere, but it's meant to be able to be accessible to an audience and to really hear the words and to be called to action to like remember these children that were taken. And it goes on, and I think there's a big repeat, big ostinato as we end into basically nothingness. And just that, like, these children were never sung to. These children were never, like my mother, I've had to piece together her experience in the boarding schools, which I'm sure is like a very common experience for many children of survivors. Like, for example, she never liked to eat lamb. Like it would be like a special day and we were gonna eat lamb chops and we'd be like, oh, exciting, me and my sisters. But my mom's like, ugh, I hate lamb. I've never liked it, which I always found odd. And then my dad told me, finally, he's like, well, she doesn't like lamb because it reminds her of the food at the boarding school because they were fed mutton like many times a week, because mutton, when they slaughter an adult sheep that's been used for many years for wool. And so it's basically the toughest, cheapest meat that you can get. And this is what these children were eating. And so she still can't do that. And she's the oldest in her family. And so she was the first one to go to the boarding school. And her other experiences, I've had to basically piece together from my aunts and uncles, and from when me and her are drinking wine and I can finally get a little bit more. So I think, but I definitely know that there wasn't a lot of comfort for these children. definitely not the ones that were murdered and not the ones that survived and came home. And so, yeah, I hope that should be part of this movement as well. Are there any questions from anybody?
Danielle, I have a question. Like the text for the Little Ones movement, is that did you write that, or is that
Yeah, I wrote that. Hmm. Yeah, so I was reading lots of statements from different survivors. I think now that the children are being uncovered, more people have been speaking out about they've been finding strength in the community and speaking out about their residential school experiences. And so I went through and tried to find everything on YouTube of these people talking about their experiences and trying to find what I thought they needed now or what they wanted. And actually, little ones is a word that came back a lot, like when people were talking about their experience, like these little ones. And yeah, and so I thought that was a good place to start with this text. And yeah, I mean, a little Easter egg, I guess. So I said a blanket of red dirt. My reservation is called Red Cliff, and it's called that because the dirt's red. So yeah. So it's kind of the text. Yeah. Did I is that enough? Would you like me to go on about that?
that was just the nerd in me wanting to know where the text came from. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
The first movement, which you had mentioned that you intentionally were emphasizing certain words. Do you want us to treat the capitalization as more than just visually? Were you hearing something with the capitalization changes?
Yeah, totally. So I chose the capitalization in a poetic manner. So for instance, like California is not capitalized when it usually would be in like correct grammar, right? But then you have forest, which is capitalized. And so with that, I was trying to, just for the musicians to know that there is a priority for the indigenous view of land and the indigenous view of where we live rather than the colonized view of the land that we're singing about in this song. Is there any, did I answer your question okay?
I have one more. So, first of all, thank you. I feel very honored to get to sing this piece. And given that we don't have Native representation within the choir, I was wondering if you had any thoughts in terms of what it means to sing this piece as a choir and do it honor when we are sharing something so painful and heavy.
Great, yeah, thank you for that question. I think that this could connect to what the coalition was just talking about, in that in order for things to be known and for changes to happen, there needs to be allies and there needs to be people outside of the indigenous community really educating and understanding and knowing about the indigenous experience and what we struggle with. And so I think that even though there isn't indigenous representation within the performers, that it still should be sung proudly, and that this piece was written for you. Like, so and I think that's something quite special too. Like, I think it would be a little different if I had written this piece for indigenous people and then a group of indigenous people performing it. Then that might be a different approach. But I wrote this with you guys and your beautiful voices and your crazy awesome artistry in mind. And so I would say sing it proudly. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the ensemble?
Any questions about Danielle?
In general.
Yeah, the conductor extraordinaire. She had a conducting debut at Kennedy Center in November, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Lincoln.
At the Manhattan School of Music is where she is educated, and you're the artistic director of Renegade Opera in Oregon.
Yep. In Portland, Oregon. Yeah.
And then letting us write. Any questions then? All right. Danielle, thanks.
Thank
you.
you.
And we love the Come With Me piece as well. So thank you so much for allowing us to do that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for doing that. It was so amazing to hear it in real life, you know, and with such fantastic like voices too. I'm honestly learning so much as a musician, having a group of such high level musicians. Like I can really like in composition, I can like trust your, that sounds weird, I guess, but yeah, I like can trust your sound. And I'm like, if I write something in this way, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I did write it that way. Maybe I'll write something different the next time, you know? So thank you so much for your artistry and for this opportunity. And yeah, I'm so excited, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so excited to hear this piece. I'm always just like, I wish I was there with the ensemble because I wanna sing it too. But yeah, we're so grateful to you and thank you for joining us. And to the ensemble, I highly recommend checking out the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition's website. They have so many resources, readings. They link out to a lot of different resources, and they also have ways to get involved within Cincinnati. So I highly encourage you to check that out. Check out Danielle's website. She's really cool. I was doing some light stalking. It's fine, but yes, just thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really fun. Yeah. Bye. Thank you.